The headline from Miami Herald: Feds to Florida, halt non-citizen voter purge. The Justice Department ordered Florida's Elections Division to halt a systematic effort to find and purge the state's voter rolls of non-citizen voters. Florida's effort appears to violate both the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which protects minorities, and the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, which governs voter purges. T. Christian Herron Jr., the Justice Department's lead civil rights lawyer, wrote in a detailed 2-page letter sent Thursday night. Again, this is the bullshit of the mainstream media, just in their sentence structure, presenting opinion as fact. Florida's effort appears to violate both the 1965 Voting Rights Act, yada, 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 so-and-so wrote in a 2-page letter. As opposed to somebody wrote a 2-page letter which asserted that. So you get the facts that they want you to swallow first before you get the attribution. It couldn't be that one person has the opinion that it appears to violate the 1965 Voting Rights Act and the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, or that a Justice Department lead civil rights lawyer, a high-ranking bureaucrat, has tried to interfere with Florida's ability to manage their own voter rolls. Now, I'm not going to advocate for free and fair elections, because an election is a way that a majority is able to impose its will on a minority, and I'm against that. But as long as you're going to have voting, you got to, is Florida in the right to purge non-citizen voters? I would think so. And part of this points to the futility of having free and fair elections, because in the United States, where we're supposed to be the gold standard, we send monitors to elections all over the world. We managed the elections in Iraq so famously with the purple ink on the fingertips of anybody who voted. And imagine that the system that we came up with for making elections fair in Iraq was more foolproof and harder to cheat than what we have in the United States. But the people that cheat in elections here in the United States, where when we have international monitors come and watch our elections, they always say, well, you guys aren't exactly living up to the standard here, and the American electorate system gets called out. So they're trying to purge non-citizen voters. And the real manipulators of the voting here in the United States obviously are not individual voters. Well, there are plenty of individual voters that cheat. Actually heard some interesting stories about that recently. But in various Republican primaries where you have Romney supporters making it harder for Ron Paul people to vote, obviously you have well, what the accusation here, get back to the big picture, in the Democrats versus Republican feud, is that there are minorities of questionable legal status. Man, that is a really PC way of describing them for Adam versus the man. But anyways, there are voters who are minorities who are more inclined to vote for Democrats, and so the sort of mythology of the story that they want you to accept is that Democrats want more open regulations on voting so that people can do same-day registration, anybody can vote, anybody can get access to the polls, there's no restrictions, because they want people who are less likely to actually meet the qualifying standards of having a state-issued identification card or some standard of residence or what have you, or the ability to speak English, and that they're really doing it not because they care about free and fair elections as much as they care about winning. And Republicans who are in control of so many states and state voting processes, as we saw in Ohio, this is where Bush, I don't want to say Bush stole the election, because there's too much evidence to suggest that Bush really was a puppet, a front man, a salesman, and had very little idea of all the things that were going on. And in Ohio, in 2004, there was an incredible manipulation by the Republican Secretary of State who was responsible for overseeing the elections. And Ohio was a huge swing state, and a lot of black voters were disenfranchised, and it was made difficult for them to vote because in areas where you had heavy concentrations of Democrats, what they did is reduce the number of polling locations and slowed it down just so there were huge, long lines to go vote. And you might think, oh, well, lines, that doesn't really, well, if the polls close and there's still a long line, if people are being restricted from voting because of the pace at which they're being put through the process, well, a lot of people fall out of those lines. A lot of people end up not voting, and the result was that Ohio went to Bush and not Kerry. So in Florida, they're trying to purge the state's voter rolls of non-citizen voters in order to get more votes for Republicans. And the reason this is such a big deal is Florida is a huge state. It's a big swing state as well in the 2012 elections. And if they, these kinds of manipulations of who is allowed to vote, whose votes are counted, as we saw in the year 2000 with the election between the campaign between George W. Bush and Al Gore, when Florida was the hotbed because it was so narrowly decided. It was a case that went to the Supreme Court, was kicked back down, and it ended up going in W's favor, obviously, as he won the election. But if it had gone the other way, and it was really down to just a few thousand votes, then Al Gore would have been president in the year 2000, and who knows how different history would have been as a result. But the idea is that the Republican Party wants to restrict voting access, and the myth, the front that they want you to believe here is that the Republican Party doesn't really believe in free and fair elections. They're the archaic, rich white reactionaries that only want white male landowners to be able to vote, and so they're always restricting it. And the Republican version of that mythology is, well, no, we really want elections to be accountable. We really want to make sure that everybody who votes is eligible to vote, and that the votes are counted properly, and that it's free and it's fair, and whatever appropriate restrictions are necessary to keep people from voting illegally, we need to do that. But it's all bullshit. It's all a shell game, and the point of elections is to really give the people to choose the frontmen, the salesmen of the policies that are determined by the powers that be behind the scenes, the true sponsors of government, the real beneficiaries of the policies that result. This is the same special interest groups that are behind both parties that are the reasons why we see that little changes when you change from Democrat-controlled government to Republican-controlled government, and it's all intended to keep you asleep, to think that the government is serving you and protecting you and keeping you safe. And as the mainstream media would tell you, everything is okay. Keep paying taxes, keep voting, and go back to sleep to your wage slave job. Keep doing what you do. Don't question anything. Don't bother yourself with the inconveniences of statism. The wars aren't really that bad. Don't worry about that. Just go back to sleep. But you've been listening to the Adam versus the Man podcast, and we have a slightly different message for you here.